Welcome to today's webinar from MaritzCX, entitled Holiday Tips for Spicing Up Those Surveys. My name is Kelly Johnson. I'm from the marketing team. I'll be moderating today's event. Joining me today are three outstanding CX experts and presenters, David Ensing, Mary Barnidge, and Dan Hickey, all from MaritzCX. I'll introduce these three more formally in just a minute, but before I do, I want to go through a few logistics with you. We usually have questions that people ask us. Is the webinar going to be recorded? And the answer is yes. A link to the recording will be sent to all attendees after today's webinar within the next 24 hours. We'll also host the webinar for on-demand review on our MaritzCX.com website at MaritzCX.com/events. There will be time for Q&A at the end of today's webinar, and you can submit your questions online, and we will get to those right after our last speaker. So now, let me introduce our speakers. David is the Vice President within MaritzCX Mobility Sector. He provides research, design, and consultation to our clients, and he facilitates continuous improvement of existing studies and manages MaritzCX internal automotive studies. David has nearly 20 years of experience conducting and overseeing automotive customer experience programs at MaritzCX and at Maritz Research. Previously, David held several positions, including Vice President of Voice of the Customer Integration and Senior Strategic Consulting Director. Prior to joining MaritzCX, David was an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio, and he completed his doctoral and master's degree in psychology from Bowling Green University and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from DePauw University. Our next presenter is Mary Barnidge. Mary serves as a MaritzCX Customer Success Client Director, and in this capacity, she is primarily responsible for overseeing the client partnerships. She ensures client business needs are being met and usually exceeded. Mary steers the overall direction and integration of programs by collaborating with her client teams and MaritzCX personnel. She has worked in the marketing research field for over 20 years as well, including extensive work in the areas of customer experience, brand equity, and product development. Her experience extends across several industries in the business-to-business space, as well as hospitality, healthcare, retail, some packaged goods, technology, and insurance. Mary has also earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in Statistics and Communications from the University of Minnesota. And wrapping us up today will be Dan Hickey. Dan is a Senior Research Manager for MaritzCX and is part of the company's financial services practice. He consults with financial service clients overseeing all aspects of the research design, data analysis, and reporting. Dan has 30 years of experience in the financial services sector, having held Vice President and Director positions first at JP Chase and then at UBS Financial Services. At UBS, Dan successfully managed research projects aimed at the company's U.S.-based wealth management clients and developed processes and procedures that served as best practices. At JP Chase, he oversaw the VOC survey initiative relating to the company's home finance, consumer banking, and small business divisions. Dan holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the Graduate School of the City University of New York, a master's degree from Bernard Baruch College, and a Bachelor's of Arts from Iona. And by the way, he's also a Six Sigma black belt trained. So now you know a little bit about our presenters, and with that, I'm going to turn the time over to David Ensing. David.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this kind of week before the holidays. As Kelly mentioned, we have three presenters today, and I only have about 10 or 15 minutes, so I'm going to steal my own thunder by letting you know in advance what I want you to get out of my portion of this presentation. First of all, if you have a reasonable length customer experience survey, and by that I mean about 5-6 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and if you're thinking about shortening that down to increase your response rates, you might think twice about that, and we're going to talk about why. Second, to decide if your survey needs to be shortened, you should really be looking at abandonment rates, not response rates. Third, if you do decide to shorten your survey, you should use a backwards research process to decide what to keep. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then finally, if you're going to shorten a survey, do pilot tests, because pilot tests are your friend. Okay, why think twice about shortening a survey? We did a study of about 1,000 customers earlier this year and asked them about survey taking. And by the way, 1,000 respondents will get you a margin of error of about plus or minus 3% for any size population, including the entire United States, or basically an infinite population. So that's a really solid sample. And let's look at what people said about survey taking. A lot of people worry that customers are being over-surveyed right now, and that's why we should shorten our surveys. And as you can see from this slide, we asked people if their number of surveys they've received over the last 3 years has increased or decreased. And what we got is that, some people do say that it has increased, but not by a lot. Only 11% said that surveys have increased significantly, 31% said slightly, and about 50% said that they've remained the same. So that doesn't seem like, a big change. Also, almost 3/4 of people say that they get 2 or less surveys, customer experience surveys, in a month. I don't know about you, but to me, that doesn't seem very overwhelming, 2 a month. Also, over the past 3 years, even though people say they're getting more surveys, 88% of people say that their willingness to complete surveys has either stayed the same or increased, and 30% says their willingness has increased. So that doesn't seem to indicate that people are overwhelmed either. And then finally, we asked people what is their preferred method of providing feedback to a company when they've had a disappointing experience. And you can see from this chart that responding to a customer feedback survey was the most preferred method of the ones that we listed by 41% of the respondents. So people want to respond that way. And if you also note here that responding by posting a complaint on Twitter, that was at 2%, or posting a complaint on other social media sites, that was at 5%. That really isn't a preferred method of addressing a negative issue with a company. It seems like most customers want a more private communication channel to communicate with their company if they've had a bad experience. And I think that probably goes more so for customers that are generally happy with their company. They don't want to make a big deal out of it. They just want to get things fixed. So that's what people say about responding to customer surveys. Let's look a little bit at what people do as well. So these are 2 pretty typical survey response funnels. One for a program with good response rates, that's over on the left, 54%, and one with kind of lower response rates, 20%. I want to point out 2 things. First, the vast majority of non-response occurs when customers never even start a survey. 43% of the customers on the funnel on the left and 68% of the customers on the right. So obviously, shortening your survey is not going to help that. What you need to do is to work on your survey invitation. And by the way, earlier this year, I wrote a paper with a colleague in our e-delivery group about how to improve email survey invitations. You can find it at the resource library at our website, MaritzCX.com, in the resource library. It's called The Art and Science of Survey Invitations, but the easiest way to find it is just to search on the term The Art and Science. And it offers 24 tips, both technical and non-technical, to help improve response rates. Second thing that I want you to notice here is that when abandonment within a survey does happen, it often happens at the very first page of the survey rather than later on. So again, that seems to indicate length probably isn't an issue. The 2 usual suspects when people abandon at the first page of a survey are either formatting, so maybe the survey has a bad format, and especially on mobile devices. So make sure to test your surveys on mobile devices and using different mobile devices, because now up to 60% of customers are answering email surveys on mobile devices, and they're really hard to format. So that's a big issue. The other issue that can drive abandonment at the first page is what we call quick start. So quick start is when you put a survey question within the invitation, and they can click on that question and it brings them to the survey. Now, quick start in general increases response rates, but it also increases abandonment rates. And that's because a lot more people start the survey. Some of them really weren't intending to start it, so they drop out, so your abandonment goes up. But enough people hang on and finish the survey to also drive up your response rates. So those are some things to think about what customers do. Also, in some of our surveys, we ask customers after they've filled out a core survey, and that survey is usually about 5, 6, 7 minutes in length. We say, hey, would you be willing to answer some more questions? And these are some examples of asking that. And, from usually about 50% up to 75, 80% of people agree to go on and answer more questions. So from that evidence, it doesn't seem like survey length is a problem for them. So given that information, what should you consider when shortening your survey? As I mentioned, the first thing is look at your abandonment rates, not your response rates, to determine if you need to shorten a survey. And if you can, look at where they abandon the survey. If they're abandoning it in the first page, it's probably not a length issue. If they're abandoning it, pages after that, it very well might be a length issue. So look at abandonment rates and where they abandon. Next, use a backward research process to determine what you want to cut. And by that, what we mean is think about what decisions you want to make and what you want to tell people about the data, and think about your ends before you design the survey, before you figure out what to cut. So figure that out and then make your cuts from there. And when you think about that, don't just think about how you, who are probably people within your corporate environment, use the data, or your corporate marketing research environment. Think about how other people in your corporation use the data, and also think about how your frontline people use the data, because different people use the data differently, and you need to account for that in your survey. We've had a number of times when clients have really cut back their surveys, and because they didn't use a backward research process, they come back to us and say, hey, now I don't know what to tell my retailers about how they should improve, because we've taken out a lot of our diagnostic items. So again, think about what decisions you want to make, what you want to tell people, what you want to be able to diagnose, and then make sure you have those things in your survey even after you cut it down. If your CX survey has some sort of compensation based off of it, either for frontline units or frontline personnel, if they have bonuses off of it, anything like that, I strongly encourage you to ask questions, quantitative questions, to drive those metrics, because we've had clients try to base those things off of just comments and doing analyzing of comments, but that's a lot harder to defend than an actual score that every customer gets. So I feel pretty strongly that when compensation is at stake, a good quantitative question is called for. Also, if you shorten your survey, do make sure to include some sort of catch-all, open-ended question, because customers want to be able to tell their stories. And actually, you can kind of be doing a disservice to a customer if you give them a real short survey and they don't feel like they can answer it, and that they can get across what they really need to get across. So have a catch-all, open-ended question so people can feel like they're being heard. And then you, depending on volume, should probably use text analysis to categorize those comments, score those comments, so you can tell what they're saying. For most CX programs, a survey of about 5 to 6 minutes is appropriate. At least that's in our experience. That seems to be a good point where people don't drop off, and you can usually get the information that you need. Of course, in those, try to ask the information you need and not have a bunch of, good to know or, nice to know questions, but things you don't really need. And then finally, as I mentioned before, pilot tests, especially when shortening a survey, are really helpful and really easy to do. Because if you have an ongoing program and it's a long survey, and you shorten it down, all you need to do is send that shorter survey to a random sample, and it's really important that it's a random sample, of maybe 1,000 customers. And you can look at the response rates for the short versus the longer one that you're already doing and see if it's really helping your response rate or not. And for most programs, sending out 1,000 survey invitations isn't that big of a deal. Now, if you want to look at how the scores might change, then you're going to need to send out more than 1,000, because then your base isn't the 1,000 you sent out. The base that you're working from is how many responses you got back. Okay, one last plug for our website. I also wrote up this presentation, or my part of this presentation, in a paper form. If that would be helpful to you, you can find that at our resource library as well. It's called How Short Should You Make Your Customer Experience Survey? So you can just search on it there. Now, I'll turn it over to Mary to talk about improving response rates.
Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. So as Dave indicated, I'll be sharing some tips on how you can increase your survey response rates, and I'm going to be bucketing these into 4 different categories. I'll be explaining how you can verbally, visually, rationally, and technically do things to your invitation to elicit a greater response. And I'll spend a few minutes in each of these categories. So for starters, there's much to consider about what you say and how you say it when it comes to survey invitations. Our behavioral scientists at MaritzCX do a lot of research about motivation and what motivates people to respond to a survey invitation. They have determined that including a call to action in the subject line of the email motivates customers to participate. So something like "help us improve" is a good example, or "please tell us what you think." Things along those lines or of that nature. So by asking the customer what you're after and asking for their help or opinion is much more motivational than a subject line that just plainly states customer satisfaction survey. Gee, can't wait to open that email. We recently tested the use of including final reminder in the subject line of a reminder. And this also includes some kind of a sense of urgency. And that's proved to be very motivational as well, as we've seen some lifts of 10 to 15% in survey response when you use that kind of reminder. The next tip is about personalization. So use the customer's name in the invitation if you're lucky enough to have that information available in the sample file. So use it in the salutation, but also consider adding it to the subject line. So for example, use something like "Mary, help us improve," or "Mary, tell us what you think." This is going to be more attention grabbing and will drive response. And if the customer name isn't available in your sample data, please refrain from calling them or using the term "dear valued customer." It's just not believable. I think using "dear customer" is a much better option. Personalize your invitation with other pertinent information related to the purpose of the survey and why you're seeking their feedback. So this is especially important on a transactional survey, so that could include, the day of that transaction or what product they purchased or why they called. So this makes that experience more engaging and you're more likely to elicit a response. Another tip on personalization is make sure the from address include a named individual in your organization, such as Jane Doe from the Chief Customer Office, or Tom Johnson, the Eastern Region Manager, something like that. And use their name as the signator and include their signature if you can. People are more curious and will open and read email if it's from someone as opposed to a general company. And they're more likely to respond if it's tied to an individual. Another tip, be brief. Keep your text to 2 to 3 sentences, not 2 to 3 paragraphs. Most people just don't have the time or the patience to read a long email. And if it's too long to read, they may decide to read it later, and you know they'll never come back to it. Okay, so there are many considerations for how you can visually lay out your invitation. First of all, make sure it's mobile optimized. This is becoming more and more important as 50 to 80% of consumers are reading their email on their phone and they're taking surveys on their mobile devices. The percentage is lower on the B2B side, but it's still important to have the layout optimized for both mobile and desktop. So if you've ever gone to a website on your phone and it wasn't optimized for mobile, you know what I'm talking about. So there's lots of left and right scrolling, and the font size is too small to read, and the menus aren't working the way you would expect. So a survey that isn't mobile optimized will have similar issues. And our research has shown that there's higher drop-off rates when mobile survey takers are taking a non-mobile optimized survey. Another visual tip is the use of graphics. But be careful not to overdo it. You can include your brand logo or a picture that represents your brand in the header of your invite, but make sure it just takes up a very narrow amount of space at the top, and it does not cause your customer to scroll down to read the text. So if a recipient cannot see the text when they open that email, they're less likely to respond, and they're just likely to close it out and delete it. Another tip on graphics is to use a graphic to indicate where you want them to start the survey rather than just underline text. So it makes it more obvious about the step they need to take to begin the survey. Just makes it very clear. And use directive language such as click here or start survey. And again, this is much more motivational. Another tip is Dave was talking about is what we call a quick start question in the invitation, where we take a survey question, we put it in the invite, and leave the survey options, response options there. And by clicking on a response to that question, they're immediately entered into the survey. A final visual tip here is minimizing the non-significant text. So things like opt-outs and privacy policies and GDPR compliance and other instructions. We need to include a lot of these things in our emails today, but they can be in the fine print, like way at the bottom of the email, shaded with a line drawn above and a lot of white space between that and your actual survey invitation content. So it just kind of makes it less cluttered. So here's a couple of examples of survey invitations. One that used our verbal and visual principles and one that does not. So just want to ask, which survey is more likely to motivate you to participate? Right, the one on the right. Kind of amazing the difference, and how much more engaging that one on the right is. So by the way, the one on the left, we actually retooled that and applied our best practices and principles, and we were able to triple the response rates from, I think it was 5% to 15%. So pretty amazing. On the rational side, beyond asking them to respond in the subject line and in your text, you should consider offering something to them in return. It doesn't have to be cash, doesn't need to be a sweepstakes, although sweepstakes can be pretty successful. But just having a bold, presumptuous thank you for your help also works wonders. Another idea is to share improvements that your company has made based on prior survey results. The point is, make your customers feel that the time they're spending is well worth it. They're going to get something in return. Communicating to your customers about the purpose of the program, I think, is of utmost importance. customers shouldn't be surprised to get a survey. They should be looking forward to it and looking forward to completing it. So I think our industry needs to do a little work there. Pre-notifications also have proven to be successful in driving response. And the more CX is becoming front and center in corporate decision making, and those organizations that fully embrace CX and clearly speak about the importance, of customer feedback, and they're walking the talk, those organizations are going to have higher survey response rates because their customers know that it's important to them, that they need the information for business decision making. So it's going to be worth their time. And finally, don't over-survey your customers. Keep the surveys to a reasonable length, as Dave was indicating, but also keep it fresh. And you do this by changing up the invitations on a regular basis. I say at least annually. I've seen customers less likely to respond if they receive the same exact invitation a year later because no one bothered to update it. And the customer's thinking, I already completed that. I don't need to do that again. And we all want them to respond again, right? Because it's important to get those annual reads or quarterly or what have you. So make sure to differentiate the invitation from the last time they might have received it. Switch out the subject line or update the imagery, make some modifications to the text, and this will also help to drive response. And finally, technically, there's a lot of tips to consider. Practicing good sample hygiene by ensuring your sample doesn't include duplicates is definitely an important tip. But make sure that your sample lists aren't old and contain email addresses that are invalid and out of date, since that has a critical impact on deliverability. If you have a sample list with a high proportion of bad email addresses, not only are you not delivering invitations to those bad email addresses, but you're also impacting your reputation, and the deliverability of the good emails in your list could be hampered as well. Now, ISPs look to blacklist and quarantine messages from domains that are offenders, and it's really hard to get back in their good graces. Litmus testing and Bright Verify are tools available in the market, and they can be used to ensure your invitation is set up optimally and your list is clean. Another tip that actually could be its own webinar is to set up authentication on your from address through the use of SPF, DKIM, DMARC. These are ways in which you can authenticate your email and prove to the ISPs you're authorized to send the email and are not a spammer. So lots in there. Throttling volumes is another good tip. In other words, you don't want to send everyone out on the same day at the same time. Spread out the volume over several hours and several days. And actually, continuous, predictable daily volume sent to ISPs lead to the most success with deliverability. You don't want to surprise them. And my last tip is make sure you're monitoring your deliverability at the ISP level on an ongoing basis. So something that got through today or yesterday may not work today. Things can change overnight as software changes and upgrades occur. So address any issues related to those hard and soft bounces immediately so that you're not impacting your sample representativeness. Those are my tips. Thanks for listening, and I'm going to turn it over now to Dan to talk about goal setting.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. So Dave took us through how to best design the survey to get the most out of it, and then Mary walked us through how to get people to answer the survey. So the next logical question is, we don't do surveys just for the sake of doing surveys. We want to improve. So part of that process is setting goals. So the first thing that we want to think about when we're talking about goal setting is, what type of goal do we need? And we want to think about it in three different categories. So the first is how we're measuring the goal. Now, the ones that we're probably most familiar with are outcome goals. So we're going to improve satisfaction or NPS, or whatever we're measuring in the survey. It might be one question, it might be several questions, but we're going to try to improve that number. But we can also look at activities, and we can set specific goals around activities. Now, those could be very specific individual activities, like setting up meetings with clients or greeting people when they come into our branch or store, or they could be larger strategic initiatives that we're taking on and getting those in place. But we can set goals around activities, and we can also use a combination of those. So we may have an overall outcome goal, but then we have underlying activity goals that are designed to achieve that outcome. So we can be measuring at both levels. And even if we're not setting formal goals around activities, we should certainly be thinking about what activities move our outcomes so that we're keeping an eye on that even if we're not setting formal goals around them. The second piece to think about is at what level do we want to set the goal? Are we going to set a goal for our firm? And so we're going to improve satisfaction for the firm by X%. Or are these going to be more individual goals? They might be at an individual relationship manager, or they might be at a branch or store level. So are they more localized goals? And again, just as with the type of goal that we're setting, the measurement type, we can have a hybrid here as well. So we could have an overall goal at the firm level, but then we could also have goals more local, that are more locally set. And these should be in tandem with each other, but they don't have to be identical. The goals can be set to be appropriate to their level. And then finally, we want to think about reward. If the goal is achieved, are we going to do direct reward? So the goal has been hit, and here is the compensation or whatever type of reward, monetary or non-monetary, that people are going to get for hitting the goal. But the other way people can be rewarded is indirect. So achieving the goal will drive some other outcomes that are directly compensated. So if we improve our satisfaction, we're going to hit our sales goals, or we're going to hit our retention goals. So we're using this as a way to achieve other goals that we're already compensated for. So again, there's not a right or wrong to these different types of goals, but you want to have a strategy in mind when you're setting the goals so that we're doing this in a way that makes sense. All right, so now to get into the particulars of the goals, we want our goals to be SMART goals, right? We want them to be goals that can motivate and move performance. And you've probably heard this in other contexts, but again, it is particularly appropriate here when we're talking about CX goals. So, and I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail, but we want the goals to be specific. That is, we know what needs to be achieved. It's not vague. In order to be specific, it also has to be measurable. That can sometimes be more of a challenge for activity goals than for outcome goals, particularly in our CX programs where an outcome goal can be from our surveys. But if we're setting activity goals, how do we measure that? How do we know the activity is happening? Attainable. In order for goals to be motivating, people have to believe that it is realistic to attain that goal. And if there's anything where firms often fall short in getting the goal setting right, it's often this. There can be a tendency to think that just setting a goal high is more motivating. But if that goal is seen as unachievable or unachievable in the time frame that it's expected, it's not going to be motivating. People have to believe that they can actually attain that goal. The goal also has to be relevant. It has to make sense that things within my span of control are going to get me closer to this goal. And again, this is particularly true when the goal is an outcome goal, right? Because if it's activity-based, then presumably the activities are things that I do or can do. But if it's an outcome goal, I have to be able to see a line of sight between what I can do and moving that measure. And then finally, it needs to be time-based. It can't be open-ended. We're going to improve satisfaction when. So we want these to be time-based. So let's go into a little bit more detail on each of these. First, just in terms of specificity, right? So in outcome goals, that's usually pretty straightforward, right? So we have a metric, but when we choose our metric, so let's say it's NPS, we don't want to just say that our goal is to improve NPS. We want a target. So we need a number. It can be an NPS number, it can be an improvement percentage, but it needs to be something that is specific so that people know what it means. When we're looking at activity, we also need to make this specific. So I need to have a specific target. It can't be simply contacting more of my customers. I need a target. Is it 80% contacting 80% of the customers in my portfolio? So it needs to be something that people know when they've hit that goal. And that's actually very much related to our second, which is the goal measurable? And at the basic, it has to be something that can be observed or recorded. Now again, for our outcome goals, that's typically our CX program surveys. So that's usually pretty straightforward. For activity goals, we still have to remember that it has to be something that can be recorded. So that might be mystery shops, it might be manager observations, it could be recorded activities, such as attending certain training courses, but it has to be something that can be recorded and measured. It has to be valid. Now this might seem obvious, but it's important to ensure that the objective that's being measured is aligned to the actual measurement. So for example, if we have a goal to improve our problem handling, but instead we measure problem incidents, that's not really a valid measure. We're not measuring problem handling, we're measuring something else. So we have to make sure that whatever it is that we want to achieve, this is a valid measure of that. And we also need to be sure that it's reliable. That is, that it's going to be consistent over time. Usually the biggest challenge to reliability is a low sample size. And that's particularly true for goals that we're setting locally at, say, branch or store levels, where even though our overall program may be getting a lot of responses, we may be getting far fewer at a branch or store, particularly our smaller ones. So we have to be sure that these measures are reliable and aren't bouncing all over the place just out of measurement error or some other source of error, because otherwise people are not going to have confidence in these goals. So that brings us to the next point, is making sure that the goals that we're setting are attainable. And here outlined a few things that you can be looking at in order to set a goal that's attainable. Now the first thing is just, what's the history been? Assuming that this is not the first time you're measuring, what has your historic change been? Have you been moving up incrementally year over year? Have the numbers been flat? What's the largest and smallest year over year change that you've achieved? So that gives you one guardrail, right? So I don't necessarily want to set a goal that's way above my history, unless I really have a good rationale for how we're going to achieve that. A second thing to look at is benchmarking. Now this can be both internal and or external. So we could look at what's the best that's been achieved within our departments or our stores or our branches. We can also look outside of our own firm, and we can even look outside of our own industry. But we do want to make sure that when we look at these benchmarks, we're marrying that to that sense of history, right? So We don't necessarily want to start by going after the best in class as our one-year goal, because that's not necessarily going to be attainable. What is something that's reasonable? The other piece that we can look at is typically, again, particularly when we're setting outcome goals, so if we're going to try to move our satisfaction with our firm, well, what's driving that? And if we take, say, our top 2 or 3 drivers, and we say, okay, I'm going to focus on these this year, and here's how much I think I can improve each of these. Well, if we develop a model, key driver model, we can actually estimate how much impact that will have on our overall outcome, and that could be part of what we take into account in setting a goal. Now, goal setting is part art and part science, so these are all the inputs. But then we have to take those and put them together and just say, okay, where does that leave us in terms of what we think is a reasonable goal? And the final thing you want to think about when you're setting that goal is minding the gap. You want to be sure that a goal is large enough to be motivating, but not so large that it seems unattainable. And again, that's why I said at the beginning, this is often where firms go awry. They tend to think that setting a goal that's very high is very motivating. In fact, it can be just the opposite. It's very demotivating if it feels unattainable. So it's better to be setting incremental year-to-year improvement goals that you hit, which then further motivate people the next year. Well, we got this year's goal. Yes, let's move it up. Let's keep going. Okay. Then next, we also want to be sure that the goal is relevant. And this is critical because even when the goal is attainable, I have to see a line of sight between what I can do and the movement in this goal. And that can be particularly challenging for outcome goals and ones that are set at the higher level. So if I'm looking at NPS for our firm, well, do I have a line of sight to what is going to move that number? And if I don't, I'm not going to feel motivated to change. So I need to be able to see a direct line of sight. This is also why a combination of outcome and activity goals can be so useful, because if we know what we think will move these numbers and we align people to that and say, here's what we're expecting to you in terms of behaviors, then people can be working towards those activity goals, and that should in turn move the outcome goal. So again, very important that there is a line of sight between the goal and what I can actually control. And then finally, what is the right time frame for a goal? Right? And unfortunately, like many things that we come across, the answer is it depends. The first question we need to ask ourselves is, how long is it going to take to reasonably be able to achieve this goal? Is this something that could be moved in the short term, or is this a lot of history that we have to unbundle to move this? So if our customers have been upset with our pricing and our service for a long time, we're going to need to deliver at a higher level for a certain period of time for them to begin to see this as the new norm and have it reflected in our surveys. And we want to take that into account when we're setting our goals. The other thing to keep in mind is that if the goals are at the local level, say a branch or a store, how long is it going to take us to get sufficient measurements in order to have a reliable score at these lower levels and also at the smallest unit? So if I'm setting goals at a branch or a store, how many surveys come back to the smallest of my stores or branches? Because I want to be sure that we're getting enough of those so that the number that they're getting is reliable as well, and that makes their goal fair. And so we'll have to take that into account in setting our time frame. And so while measuring the progress towards the goal on a regular basis is a great practice, we want to be sure that the time frame we set allows for time for change to take effect. Annual goals are the most typical, and for most things that will work well. But for some goals, that may actually need to be longer, and there are one of two things we can do. We either just accept that and set a longer time frame for the goals, or we may look at intermediate goals, whether those are activity goals or in the case of, say, moving satisfaction or NPS, we might set a goal on moving one or more of the key drivers. And that's our annual goal, with the ultimate goal of moving our overall satisfaction and NPS, which might be a 3-year goal or a 5-year goal. But we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is achievable in the time frame that we're measuring. So let me just wrap up with a few key considerations in terms of setting goals. So the first is what we talked about at the beginning: match the goal type to your strategic objectives. So should this be an outcome goal? Should people be directly compensated, or do they already buy into the idea that this will achieve their sales goals or whatever other goals they're already being compensated for, and so you're measuring for the indirect benefit? One of the things that we didn't talk about earlier, but this is an important consideration, is whenever possible, avoid all or nothing goals. And this is particularly true with outcome goals. But when you set a specific number and you consider that achieved only when you hit that number, it can be demotivating if people are coming close to that number. So you want to set some ranges that could be, so that could be stretch goals, or that could be our goal has a range from 75% to 80%. But the point is that you don't want to necessarily set a goal at an absolute level so that if people realize halfway through the year there's no way they're going to achieve that goal, you're losing the motivation. So you want people to be able to hit at different tiers. Set up clear expectations about what behaviors are allowed and what are not allowed. And this, again, is particularly true when we're setting goals for satisfaction at, say, a branch or a store. What is it that you want them to do and want them to focus on? Typically, we don't want them asking for a specific score. We want them to focus on the delivery and not on the survey. So we also want to be sure that we don't allow any kind of unethical behavior or behavior that's at cross purposes to what we're trying to achieve as a business. Inventory your goals to make sure that the goals are not unintentionally at cross purposes. While here we're talking primarily about our customer experience goals, every firm has more than one goal. And you want to be sure that the goals that you've set aren't actually working at cross purposes to each other. So I want to make sure that my sales goals don't undermine my CX goals and vice versa. So look at the various goals and make sure that they are working in tandem, not at cross purposes. As we talked about with the relevance of the goal, make sure that whatever goals you're setting, you can identify and communicate a clear line of sight between what staff at every level that are being impacted by that goal can do and have control over, and how they can move that goal. They need to understand what they're expected to do and how they can do it in order for goals to be motivating and to really work toward the end that we want them to do. And finally, make sure that the goal doesn't overshadow the larger strategic objective. We don't want to improve NPS or our satisfaction scores for the sake of improving those. We want to improve them because we are actually delivering a better experience that in turn is going to improve our business performance. So we want to be sure that the measure, the goal, doesn't become larger than the overall strategy. So we don't want the tail to wag the dog. The goal is in service of our business objectives, not the other way around. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kelly for questions.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mary and Dave. We really appreciate your insight, your expertise, and just the effort in bringing this content to us and this information. So I learned a lot, and I work in this daily, and I'm sure that our audience has learned a lot. But we had quite a few questions come in, so we're going to take some time to answer those questions. If we do not get to your question, we will respond to you via email, either one of our presenters or myself. So the first question, I believe, came in for you, Dave. It is around slide number 14, what customers do, the funnel slide, and it is, do these numbers include a B2B audience?
Oh, that's a good question. So the funnel slide was not based off of B2B. It was based off of business to customer. But that being said, I'd be shocked if a business to business survey didn't look somewhat like that. The absolute numbers are probably different, probably a little lower in response rates. But the fall off from surveys being sent to surveys open being the biggest difference, I'd be shocked if that wasn't the biggest place of falling off. So the story remains the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure does. Great, thank you. Thank you, Dave. We have a few for you, Mary, as well that came in.
Sure.
So I think let's go with, if we don't have a reliable source to use the client's name for personalization, such as Dear John Doe, what do you recommend, since it is not recommended to say Dear Valued Customer?
Mm-hmm. Right. If you have any personal information that you could incorporate into that salutation, like, well, you know that they're your customer, so it could be a Dear Company XYZ customer, or Dear Customer is fine, or Dear Customer in this region. You know, something else in the sample file that could make it a little more personalized is what I would recommend.
Oh, great answers. Thank you, Mary. Here's another one on kind of invites. Is it better to address full name or just first name in the invite?
You know, I think it depends on how formal of a relationship you have with your customers. So, you know, it's more casual. I think just saying, hey, Dear Mary is fine. But if you have a little more formal relationship, then including the full name is probably better. And again, you know, Dave talked about pilot testing. You can certainly do that, or talk in focus groups with your customers to find out how they would like to be addressed if you're not sure.
Okay, thank you. A couple more kind of in that invite area. Do you include a full survey link in the invitation or a hyperlink?
Well, we recommend, like I was talking about, the use of a graphic that would have the hyperlink to the survey embedded in it. You know, back in the old days, we would always say if the link isn't active, then you cut and paste, and you can include that in the fine print at the bottom for the full survey length. But I would use a hyperlink to keep it a little cleaner. Great,
thank you, Mary. Hey, Dan, we're going to move over to a couple on goal setting. Where did that go? Is this a better goal? Increase rep kudos via very satisfied by 5% this month? Does that make sense?
I think so. So I think, just if I'm understanding the question, if it's being measured off of the survey, so that the percent very satisfied by 5%, yes, that's a specific goal. Now, we'd want to think about the history and what it takes to be achievable. The only thing when mentioned kudos is I would tend to prefer to have it come out of the survey. So if that's where you're saying the percent very satisfied, great. If you're looking at kudos, there's the spontaneous. And the only thing that can be problematic there is people may have had a great experience, but they don't bother telling anyone. So you'd rather do it off of the formal survey, I think, because that's going to create a more level playing field.
Hey, Dan, there's some additional information that was just sent that
Sure.
how am I going to get a line of sight in an activity goal such as this? So the goal is decrease the number of calls to the call center because the live chat was a first touch resolution. We measure the live chat CX experience via voice of customer transactional survey. Does that help?
So I think that's actually in some ways more of an outcome goal than an activity. So it probably needs a little bit more of a diagnostic. So what experiences are driving that movement to the call center, and then focus the goals on that. So it could be particular activities of the rep, or it could be something that's measured in the survey. So I think the piece of it there is doing a little more of the diagnostic around why are calls moving from one channel to the other, if I'm understanding it correctly, and then set the goals on those drivers. So, and then you could still have the ultimate outcome being the decrease in volume, but the activities you want to focus on are what activities would keep the call in the original channel that you want to not migrate over and increase those behaviors.
Great, thank you, Dan. I think that helped. I'm going to do one more, and then if we did not get to your question, we will send out responses to you personally. The last one, Dave, is back to the funnel slide number 14, I believe. The two funnels are labeled the same but have different numbers, and he wasn't quite sure what they were, what the differences are in those two funnels.
Yeah, and I noticed that we had another question kind of about the same thing, so I apologize for the confusion. Those are just two example cases, so think about them as two case studies. So one with more of a higher response rate at 54%, another survey with a lower response rate of about 20%. But pretty much, all the surveys that I've looked at follow this general pattern, but they're just two example cases. And both of these were business to customer.
Great. Thank you for the clarification, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
We'd like to thank you. We've come up to time now. We'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Again, we will send out the recorded version of this webinar to you within the next 24 hours, and it will also be hosted on MaritzCX.com's website. So thank you for joining, and have a wonderful holiday season.